Hey everyone, Nancy Morris here with another episode of the Morris Code. Today is a Facebook Live. It is Monday, the 5th of March, and welcome to another episode of the Morris Code. As I just said a moment ago, I've got a new light staring me in the face, and it's probably going to throw me off, but I've had some problems with the lighting in this room, so needed to get a new light bulb, and it's quite bright. So I'm just going to fill a few seconds here, so skip forward a few seconds if you want, to wait for a couple of people to show up. What are we talking about today? We're talking about something that is quite widespread, more widespread than most people would care to admit. And it is what's known as the fraud factor. Now, quite a lot of people would call it it's officially known as the imposter syndrome. That's the name. It's usually studied in psychology and other behavioral sciences, the imposter syndrome. But the easiest thing that people understand is the fraud factor. That noise inside your head that says you're a bit of a fraud, that you don't know what you're doing, or perhaps, it's you're going to get found out, and it's not good. So today we're going to cover a few points, and I've just written them down to make sure I stay in the right order and get them sorted out properly. But we're going to talk about how prevalent it actually is, the fraud factor, the different ways that it might be showing up for you that you might not even realize are the result of the fraud factor. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about why we get the fraud factor, and then I'm going to share with you some ways that you could actually reduce or eliminate the fraud factor from your life. It is, as I say, quite prevalent, and people don't really realize how much of their behavior is limited, modified, changed, or whatever from this idea that perhaps they're an imposter. In other words, they're going to get found out as a fraud. They're going to get found out as that they don't know what they're talking about. And it really impacts our behavior much more than we think. And I'm just going to pause for a second and welcome anyone on the Facebook Live who wants to say hi and let me know that you're here. Hi and welcome. It's good to see people joining. So what is this fraud factor? What's it all about? Well, the fraud factor is a mental process. It's a way that we're thinking that really sort of limits us. We feel less than. We feel that we are unworthy of what it is that perhaps we're talking about, and we don't know what we're doing. We're unworthy of the praise that we get for things that we're doing or actions that we're taking. And it is this process that changes behavior. That's the key part. It's this way that we're thinking that's changing our behavior. So why do we care? Well, because it really impacts your productivity. It impacts whether or not you're going to be productive, and more importantly, it impacts whether or not you're going to stay consistently productive, which is what I'm focused on. It's one thing to help somebody become more productive, or it's one thing to become productive. It's another thing to do that consistently over time, which is really important for one's career, and particularly if one is running their own business and is responsible for bringing money into their company or into the company that they work for. So that's why it's important to understand the way that this thinking process is changing our behavior. I said a moment ago that in actual fact, this notion of the fraud factor is really prevalent. Yeah, it's science. The research will show that upwards of 70% of the international working population, 70% of and even not working, those trying to find work, will feel that they are a fraud in some way or another, will feel that they are going to get found out, that they cannot live up to the position that they're in or the position that they're vying for, something along those lines. But more worrisome than that is the science is showing that upwards of 50% of the population feels like an imposter today. In other words, more often than not, 50% of the workforce out there feels like they're a fraud. That's a big number, and it significantly impacts productivity. So why do we feel this fraud factor? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, predominantly because we perhaps lack self-esteem. We're not feeling very good about ourselves, and that's impacting then if we're in a position of needing to make decisions or needing to produce something important or just get through the day. The other reason why it might be showing up is because a lot of people fear looking arrogant. So because we fear this looking arrogant, we're less likely to sing our praises, or we're less likely to talk about ourselves in a way, or even receive praise, because we're going to look arrogant, or we think we're going to look arrogant. Another interesting reason why people get this fraud factor or this imposter syndrome is this notion of fear of success. Now, some research says it's the fear of failure that really, underlies some of the fraud factor, but other research and my own opinion would suggest that it's actually the fear of success, because if you're limiting your productivity, if you're limiting the choices that you're making, then you're already kind of failing. I don't like that word, but that's where you are, and you're staying there. So rather than change the behavior and become perhaps more successful, you're staying where you are using or because of the imposter syndrome. So I would suggest, as does some of the research, that it's actually a fear of success that underlies part of the fraud factor. Also, if you never really learned when you were younger how to truly appreciate who you are, or acknowledge your successes, or pat yourself on the back, it'll be difficult for you to accept that from other people. So you can't see your own accomplishments, and that will impact and create part of the fraud factor. Not only that, though, is something in science known as automatic vigilance, and that's the brain's natural tendency to notice the negative. So if you start on this path of talking to yourself in a negative way, well, it's going to continue, and therefore make the fraud factor that much more prevalent in your life. All of these things are exacerbated by how much we choose to judge other people. So if you're a person who judges other people a lot, then somewhere in your brain, you're also assuming that people judge you a lot. So the more you're doing that, the more likely it is that you fear being judged yourself. So you're going to have the fraud factor. And that's also exacerbated by how many times do you fib about your skills or abilities? When you're fibbing, when you're maybe padding the resume a little bit or overselling yourself, we also kind of make the assumption in our heads that other people are doing that when they're talking about us. So the more you do that, the more likely it is that you'll feel the fraud factor. So what are some of the ways that the fraud factor actually shows up in your life? Well, if you're a perfectionist, it is quite likely that you're also very, very concerned about being found out as not knowing what you're talking about or what you're doing. So you're going to dot all the I's and cross all the T's and be a perfectionist with that. Also, if you're overworking, if you're staying late all the time, if you're just working all the time, if you have trouble letting projects go, if you're, the last one out of the office and the first one in, or you have to do it all, you have to be involved in all the projects, then maybe you've got the fraud factor rolling around in the back of your head. Do you have really high expectations of yourself? That will also be a signal that you have the fraud factor. If you really expect a lot of yourself, then you're going to have more difficulty just being good rather than great. By the way, good is great. So if you also sort of feel unworthy of most things, that's a clear indication that you've got aspects of the fraud factor going on. So all of this fraud factor, and the reason why it's such a big concern and why I'm spending time on it today, is because when we have this negativity going on in our head, when we can't look in the mirror and see what other people see because of all the reasons I've suggested, what does that lead to? Well, it leads to making smaller goals for yourself, personal and professional. It can lead to forms of anxiety. It can lead to forms of depression. It can lead to just fundamentally having low self-confidence. All of these things negatively impact your ability to do your work. It will impact even things outside of work, personal friendships and relationships. If you're doing comparison with other people and in some way consider yourself to be a fraud, it impacts all of that. As I mentioned right at the top, it's a really prevalent thing. So up to 70% of people will report at some point in their career or business they've felt the fraud factor for more than just a few minutes, like for a significant period of time. And up to 50% of the workforce, 50% of the people out there are feeling the fraud factor frequently. I'll put my hands up and admit that in my career, I have felt the fraud factor. There is no doubt about it, particularly as somebody who's been self-employed. You end up comparing yourself all over the place to people, and you wonder what it is that you're doing wrong. And maybe they know a hell of a lot more stuff than you do, and they've got PhDs coming out of this end, and all these sorts of things that just get in your way of your daily thinking. And so you sort of shut down, or you overwork and you lead yourself to burnout. So what are some of the things that I did to overcome this, or at least manage it on a daily basis? Well, a couple of things really important is, what is your comfort zone? Whatever that is for you, you have to go outside of it one way or another. Now, for me, I have a tendency of pushing myself pretty hard to do things that I really don't want to do. So I have a picture over there of when I went skydiving. Long story short, what I won't go into, the idea basically is there was a problem when I was coming down from 4,000 feet, and it was not a good situation, but clearly I survived and all is well. But I look at that and remind myself of what I'm capable of doing, even though I don't think I am. So I reframe things in my head, perhaps over and over and over again. I push myself outside of my comfort zone. That's one of the key ways of overcoming the idea of the fraud factor. One of the other ways that people will overcome the fraud factor, or at least manage it, is and it relates to comfort zone, is public speaking. Now, we know from tons of research that public speaking is one of the things that people fear the most. They fear death less than they fear public speaking. So the old joke is people would rather be in the box than on the pulpit. So, doing public speaking, I've encouraged people to take improv classes or acting classes, for example. Really pushes you outside of your comfort zone, but oh my goodness, is it great for the fraud factor, and great for self-esteem, and great for self-confidence. It, for me, is one of the best things to do. And I'm a professional speaker, and I took a course that really challenged me. And after speaking to thousands of people, I went on another course because I like to do that. I'm a lifelong learner. And sure enough, this one stretched me outside of my comfort zone again, and it was fantastic. And it really helps a person to feel that they own the space that they're standing in when they speak, whether it's speaking to your colleague across your desk or speaking in front of 100 people. It doesn't matter. Public speaking is a great way to really push outside of your comfort zone, and do so in a safe environment, because you're also learning new skills at the same time. I mentioned, of course, how prevalent it is. It means that of the 10 friends closest to you, or 10 colleagues down the hall, or whatever it is, probably 5 of them are going to know what you're talking about if you're talking about how sometimes you feel like you're a fraud. I have no doubt in my mind that if you sat down with people you trusted and started talking to them about it, people would also put up their hand and say, yeah, me too. I feel that way as well. So you know what? Over a coffee, over a glass of wine, whatever it is, talk to a friend, a colleague about your own sense of the fraud factor, or even just one little aspect of it to get the ball rolling, to get the conversation going. Get yourself a support system. Get yourself people who understand, because really, it's kind of a cliche of saying of you're not alone, but you're really not. So many people go through this all the time, trying to figure out their place. So finding others that you could talk to about this is a great thing. On the flip side of that, though, one of the other reasons why we get the fraud factor is because we're constantly looking for external validation. And you know what? People are more concerned with themselves than they are for you. So it's very rare that you're going to get validation unless you happen to be with people who really understand how to do that. It's very rare that you're going to get the validation that you need. You have to be able to give it to yourself. So reduce the need for external validation. Get it by having a support group, but don't need it, because if you need it, it's not going to come. And therefore, when you need that kind of feedback, or you want that kind of feedback, you're not going to get it. If you can't give it to yourself, it's going to make things more difficult. So focus on being appreciative of yourself. There are ways of doing that. So for example, when you leave the office at the end of the day, when you're making your way home, instead of focusing on things that you didn't do that day, or that you feel you didn't do well, spend a few minutes on the way home just focused on what you did do, or what you did do well, or what you're proud of, or even what you're grateful for. I'm sure you've heard that the notion of gratitude is immensely important for a positive outlook, and it is. So even something like that, you know, just spending that time, but spending time with yourself, focused on the things that you did and the things that went well. Those sorts of things are really going to help to reduce the fraud factor. So really quickly, I'm just going to summarize that. Stretch yourself beyond your comfort zone. Do so on a regular basis. Perhaps you can't, you know, leap off a big building or something, and that's fine. Do something that will stretch you outside of your comfort zone. I strongly recommend learning public speaking. It's the fastest way to hit a myriad of things related to self-confidence and self-esteem, or something similar like acting classes or improv classes. And spend time in gratitude. Always spend time in gratitude, and recognize that you are not alone in feeling a bit like a fraud. We all do it. I still do it from time to time, but the difference between me then and now is that if I'm feeling a fraud factor moment, it's lasting for moments, not days or weeks. It's not so prevalent in my head anymore that I simply shut down, whereas I used to when I felt this quite significantly. So these things don't go away. There's so much that our brain does on a daily basis that sometimes things we think we've dealt with will, you know, go away, and it's like, well, why is this coming back? Because they don't really go away. They just change their dynamic a little bit. So if you feel really confident today and this has no relevance for you whatsoever, great, good for you. And in a few weeks or days or months maybe, all of a sudden you're going to be in a situation that makes you think, I'm not comfortable, and somebody's going to find out that I don't know what I'm talking about. Remember back to this conversation. Remember back to what I was saying about how you can overcome that and manage it a little bit better. The fraud factor shows up in so many different ways for so many different people, so many days of the week. It is something to put your attention on, even if you simply listen and learn from this today so that you can help someone around you. Because given the statistics and how prevalent the fraud factor is every day, people around you feel this. And it is unfortunate because, as I said, it creates anxiety and depression and low self-esteem. It really impacts our goals, and most importantly at work, it impacts our productivity. So I've babbled on for quite a few minutes now, and if there's anybody who has a quick question, let me know. I know there's a couple of people on the line, and I'd love to either see who's here or see if anybody has a quick question. The fraud factor or imposter syndrome, or whatever you want to call it, really is quite predominant out there. So, and if you don't have a question now, but you do later, that's fine. Put it in the comment section below, and I'll answer it as soon as I see it. Or send me an email. I actually find that I'm getting a lot of emails. People aren't leaving comments on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever they're catching this. They're actually sending me direct emails, which is really helpful. They're asking questions. It's helpful if it's done in a public way, like in the comment box. But if that's not comfortable for someone, just email me. As you may know, I do my Dear Nancy Q&A calls. It's do a Q&A pre-recorded video answering at least one question that I've received via email or text or phone or whatever. And so I can use your question if you're not comfortable leaving it in the comment box. Anyway, it is Monday, March 5th, and we have been talking about the fraud factor. You know, I just hope that you're able to take away a piece of information from this and use it, or share it with someone that you really care about so that you can help them understand their own daily processes a little bit better. Thanks very much for watching. Take care. Bye.